It began with a signal faint, desperate, and destined to echo for more than a century. Just before the Titanic disappeared beneath the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, the ship sent out a final distress call. In it were a few cold, clinical numbers, the coordinates of where she believed she was sinking. Those numbers, however, would become both a map and a curse, the key that promised to lead rescuers straight to her, and yet would mislead generations of explorers who came searching later. In April of 1912, the Titanic's call reached the nearby ship Carpathia, which raced through the night and rescued every known survivor. The lifeboats were found, the living were saved, but the ship itself, the grandest vessel ever built, vanished into the black silence 2.5 miles below the surface. To most people, the question after the tragedy wasn't where the Titanic was, but how to raise her. Newspapers and engineers imagined cables, cranes, even dynamite that could somehow pull the ship back to daylight. None of it was remotely possible. The ocean floor was too deep, the technology too primitive, and the idea of humans reaching such depths belonged to the realm of science fiction. For decades, the Titanic slept hidden by darkness and pressure so immense that even steel could crumble. The world above changed. 2 world wars came and went. Submarines and sonar were born, and the dream of finding the Titanic slowly evolved from fantasy to obsession. The coordinates were there, waiting, a whisper from the past, daring humanity to listen again. 73 years later, that whisper would turn into one of the greatest races of exploration in modern history. But before discovery came madness, and before triumph came decades of failure. The year was 1953. 40 years had passed since the Titanic vanished, and the sea still held its secret. A British salvager named Risten Beasley decided he would be the first to break that silence. He was no poet, no dreamer, just a practical man with a company that specialized in recovering wrecks. Yet he couldn't resist the lure of the Titanic. Armed with the coordinates from that original distress call, Beasley set out to find what generations before him could not. But the ocean, vast and indifferent, laughed at precision. The coordinates had been transmitted almost 2 hours before the ship went under 2 hours, in which the Titanic might have drifted miles away under the pull of currents and chaos. What looked simple on paper became a search area larger than any city. Beasley's plan was primitive, but in its own way, daring. He dropped charges of dynamite into the water, hoping the echoes they produced could be mapped through sonar, a crude attempt at what would one day become high-resolution ocean mapping. The idea sounded bold. The results were nothing. The sea absorbed every sound and gave nothing back. Beasley's expedition ended in failure, his name quickly forgotten. For another 20 years, silence returned. Technology advanced, but the Titanic seemed always one step beyond reach. Then, in the late 1970s, a man named Robert Ballard, a marine geologist from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, began dreaming of her again. Ballard wasn't motivated by fame or fortune. He was driven by something far quieter: curiosity, the same force that makes humans climb mountains or reach for the stars. His institution had developed a new piece of equipment, a high-tech underwater mapping system, and Ballard saw an opportunity. He proposed using it to locate the Titanic. The plan was audacious: a long pipe extending from a research vessel into the depths, with sonar and cameras attached to the end. As the ship passed over the seabed, it would sweep for any hint of the wreck. The expedition began full of hope until, suddenly, disaster struck. The drill pipe snapped. Thousands of feet of expensive equipment tumbled helplessly into the darkness, vanishing into the same depths that had swallowed the Titanic. Ballard returned home, humiliated, empty-handed, and haunted by the thought that the ocean had beaten him. Yet failure in exploration is never the end. It's the first draft of discovery. By the early 1980s, the Titanic had become more than a shipwreck. It was a myth, a ghost story that mocked every man who tried to find it. And then came Jack Grimm. Grimm was an oil tycoon from Texas, a millionaire with eccentric habits and an endless appetite for the impossible. He had already financed expeditions to find Noah's Ark, the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, even a supposed hole at the North Pole that he believed led to a hollow Earth. When he announced he would now find the Titanic, the scientific community rolled its eyes. But Grimm had something the others didn't: money, and plenty of it. He donated $300,000 to Columbia University's Lamont Geological Observatory in exchange for the technology and expertise of two respected scientists, Dr. William Ryan and Dr. Fred Spice. It was an unlikely alliance, two men of science and one showman driven by dreams and superstition. Perhaps it was that strange combination that made this expedition unforgettable. Before they even left port, Grimm made a gesture so absurd it nearly ended the journey before it began. He brought on board a small monkey he called Titan. He claimed the animal was trained to locate the Titanic by pointing at a map. The scientists were furious. To them, this was an insult to decades of serious research. They told Grimm bluntly, "Either the monkey goes, or we do." To everyone's disbelief, Grimm hesitated and then chose the monkey. Only after heated arguments and persuasion did he finally agree to leave Titan behind. The expedition could finally begin. They sailed to the coordinates from the Titanic's final distress call and lowered their equipment a side-looking sonar that sent acoustic pings in wide arcs along the seabed. The sonar worked like a flashlight in the dark, mapping shapes and textures far below. When something unusual appeared, they used a magnetometer to detect whether it was made of metal and therefore possibly man-made. But even with advanced instruments, the sea offered only silence. After weeks of scanning, they found nothing. Then the scientists made a crucial observation. The survivors of the Titanic had been rescued far east of the coordinates the ship had sent. The error, they suspected, was simple but fatal. The ship's officers had miscalculated the time zone as they sailed west. The coordinates were wrong. That revelation changed everything. It expanded the potential search area to a rectangle 1,500 meters across, vast, featureless, and unforgiving. Undeterred, the crew began a new methodical search. They called mowing the lawn, dragging the sonar in overlapping lines, covering the ocean floor inch by inch. But fate seemed determined to mock them. The magnetometer broke. A storm rolled in. Their time was running out, yet Grimm pressed on, his enthusiasm unshaken. He marked 14 suspicious sites before the ship's charter expired, and they were forced to return home. The next year, Grimm came back, this time with upgraded sonar. One by one, the 14 sites were re-examined and dismissed until the very last day. They attached the camera to a sled and dragged it over the seabed. The footage was grainy and dark until a strange curved shape appeared. It looked like a propeller. Grimm was convinced he had found the Titanic, but time ran out again. They had to leave before confirming it. He returned in 1983 to prove his discovery, but the shape was gone, swallowed by the abyss once more. Even his own scientists doubted him. The world moved on. The Titanic remained hidden, but one man, watching quietly from afar, refused to give up. His name was Robert Ballard. Robert Ballard had tasted failure once before, and it left a scar he couldn't ignore. But unlike Jack Grimm, he didn't have endless money. What he did have was something far more valuable, a relationship with the United States Navy. By the early 1980s, Ballard was back at Woods Hole, still haunted by the ghost of the Titanic. He knew the technology to find it was finally within reach. Sonar had improved. Deep-sea cameras were sharper, and remote vehicles were becoming more capable. What he lacked was funding. Searching for the Titanic could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars money. No scientific institution was willing to gamble on a dream. So Ballard came up with an idea. He proposed to the Navy the design of a new deep-sea vehicle, a remote-controlled sled called Argo, capable of exploring the ocean floor in real time. It would use side-scan sonar and video cameras, sending back live images of whatever it found. The Navy wasn't interested in the Titanic. They were interested in something else, something secret. Two American nuclear submarines, the USS Thresher and the USS Scorpion, had sunk in the Atlantic during the Cold War. The Navy wanted someone to locate and inspect their wrecks to ensure there was no radioactive threat and to keep Soviet intelligence away. Ballard struck a deal. The Navy would fund his project and let him test Argo on one condition. He had to first complete the classified submarine missions. Only after that could he use whatever time remained to search for the Titanic. It was a perfect disguise. Officially, Ballard was testing new equipment. In reality, he was on one of the most secretive ocean missions of the Cold War, and quietly preparing for the greatest discovery in maritime history. When Ballard explored the first submarine wreck, he noticed something strange. As the submarine sank and imploded, they left a trail of debris stretching away from the main wreck, heavy pieces near the core, lighter ones scattered far off, like a comet's tail. That observation sparked a revelation. Everyone had been looking for the Titanic herself, a massive steel carcass hidden under miles of water. But what if the key wasn't the ship, but the trail it left behind? If the Titanic broke apart as it sank, debris, furniture, machinery, fragments would have scattered along the ocean floor. Find the trail, and you could follow it back to the wreck. It was a brilliant, simple idea, and it would change everything. In 1984, the Navy approved Ballard's next expedition. Officially, he was to finish mapping the Scorpion. Unofficially, he was about to begin the search that would rewrite history. In the summer of 1985, the Atlantic was calm, cold, and endless, the kind of vastness that could swallow ambition whole. Robert Ballard set sail again, this time with his secret weapon fully built. Argo, the deep-sea sled he had dreamed of for years. He wasn't alone. Partnering with the French Oceanographic Institute IFREMER, Ballard worked alongside the veteran explorer Jean-Louis Michel, one of the most respected sonar experts in Europe. Together, they devised a simple but ingenious plan. Michel would lead the first phase, scanning the seafloor with advanced sonar to identify anything unusual. Ballard would then take the second phase, focusing Argo's cameras on the most promising locations. They divided the Atlantic into two large zones near the Titanic's last known position. Michel began the painstaking mowing the lawn pattern, towing sonar in perfect overlapping lines. It was slow, methodical work. The sonar traced ghostly outlines of the seabed, line after line, mile after mile. But there was nothing, just endless black sand and ridges that looked the same. By the time Ballard's turn came, the French team had found nothing. Worse, his time was running out. The U.S. Navy's funding window was closing. He had just 13 days left, 13 days to either find the Titanic or return home empty-handed again. This time, Ballard abandoned the old methods. He would not look for the ship. He would look for its shadow, the debris field. He knew from his submarine missions that heavy pieces stayed near the main wreck, while lighter fragments drifted with the current. And on that April night in 1912, the current had flowed south, so Ballard began sweeping wide paths across the ocean floor, spacing his search lines farther apart to cover more ground. He trusted Argo's cameras more than sonar live, flickering video that transmitted directly from 2.5 miles below. Day after day, the monitors showed nothing but desolate landscapes, rippling sand, scattered stones, strange shapes that turned out to be nothing at all. Crew members took turns watching the screens through the night, drinking coffee just to stay awake. The ocean floor was hypnotic, monotonous, and merciless. Then, during one of those long, sleepless nights, something changed. The shapes on the monitors started to look different, too symmetrical, too deliberate. Pipes, beams, twisted metal, unmistakably human. Someone shouted for Ballard. Within seconds, he was on deck, staring at the screen. The camera panned slowly, and then a massive, curved shadow appeared. A boiler, the unmistakable kind used on the Titanic. For a few breathless moments, no one spoke. Then the truth hit them all at once. They had found it. After 73 years, the Titanic had finally been discovered. The room erupted cheers, disbelief, tears. But as the reality sank in, silence returned. The celebration turned into something reverent. On that ghostly screen, they weren't just looking at metal. They were looking at a tomb, a monument to more than 1,500 souls lost to the sea. Once the shock faded, an eerie calm took hold of the ship. The crew of the Noir gathered around the glowing monitors as Argo's camera drifted through the darkness, revealing the resting place of a legend. First came the boilers, still aligned as if waiting to power a ship that would never move again. Then, slowly, the stern section appeared torn apart, its steel ribs jutting from the seabed like bones. About 800 yards away, they found the bow, still hauntingly intact. The railing, the anchors, even the shape of the hull, all unmistakable. For the first time since that cold April night in 1912, human eyes were seeing the Titanic again, But what they saw was not a ship of glory, it was ruin, frozen in time. Coral had begun to cover her sides, and long trails of rust dripped down like tears, creating what scientists would later call rusticles. They shimmered faintly under Argo's lights, like candle wax melting in slow motion. The realization hit everyone. This was not just history, it was grief preserved in metal. The Titanic had broken apart violently as it sank, scattering a trail of debris between the bow and stern, confirming Ballard's theory. Yet the sheer scale of destruction stunned even the experts. Every twisted piece told a story of panic, chaos, and silence that followed. Ballard asked the crew to stop the feed for a moment. The entire team stood in silence, heads bowed. On the deck above, the sea was still calm, endless, as if guarding its secret for one final witness. The news of the discovery spread around the world within days. Headlines called it the greatest maritime discovery of the 20th century. Ballard became a household name overnight, though he never saw himself as a hero. To him, the Titanic wasn't a prize, it was a grave. He made one thing clear: nothing should ever be removed. The wreck, he said, must remain undisturbed, a memorial to all who had died there. But the world does not always honor silence. Within a decade, others would come, driven by curiosity, greed, or the promise of spectacle. The Titanic had been found, and soon, people would try to lift parts of it back into the light. Once the Titanic had been found, humanity's fascination with her only deepened. Seeing her ghostly image resting 2.5 miles beneath the waves wasn't enough for some. They wanted to bring her back. They wanted to touch history. Throughout the late 1980s and into the 90s, a series of expeditions began retrieving smaller artifacts, porcelain cups, jewelry, pieces of the hull, even parts of the grand staircase. Each recovery sparked both awe and outrage. For many, the wreck was sacred ground. Disturbing it was desecration. But for others, it was a chance to preserve what the sea would eventually consume. Then, in August 1996, came the most ambitious attempt yet. A massive operation was planned to lift an entire section of the ship's outer hull, a piece the size of a house. 3 expedition ships surrounded the site, and nearby, 2 luxury cruise liners hovered like spectators at a sporting event. On board were thousands of guests, journalists, even a few of the original Titanic survivors. The plan was grand, cinematic, and doomed. Using a submersible, engineers attached dozens of inflatable bags to the giant hull piece. As the bags filled with air, the wreck began to rise, slowly ascending through the black water. Cheers erupted on the cruise ships. For a moment, it seemed the Titanic would finally return to the world above. And then nature reminded everyone who was in control. A storm was forming, Hurricane Edward, sweeping up the Atlantic faster than anyone expected. Winds howled, waves climbed, and within hours, the sea turned violent. The recovery lines snapped. The massive hull section, already near the surface, broke free and sank again, disappearing into the dark. Just as it had 84 years earlier, the mission was over. Cameras kept rolling, capturing the disbelief and heartbreak of a crew that had come within sight of victory, only to watch history slip away once more. In the end, the Titanic remained where she belonged, untouched, eternal, cradled by the ocean that had claimed her. Ballard's warning had proven true. The wreck was not meant to be raised, only remembered. Today, more than a century after that fateful night, the Titanic still rests quietly in the depths, her bow pointing forward, as if still sailing toward her impossible destination. Around her, life has returned, strange creatures drifting through her corridors, coral growing where once there were chandeliers. The story of the Titanic's rediscovery is not just about technology or triumph. It is about obsession, persistence, and the delicate line between curiosity and reverence. Because in the end, the Titanic was never truly lost. Humanity simply had to look deeper, not into the ocean, but into itself.